When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, we reveal how brand new forensic evidence uncovered by an expert witness helped catch a killer and resolve a notorious miscarriage of justice.
I'm definitely angry. I've always been angry since. They say, oh, don't be angry, let it go. Well, you let it go. Go and sit in the cell for 2 years, take you away from your family.
And we discover how forensic analysis of fragments of CCTV footage blew apart a suspect's alibi and identified him as a killer.
When you looked closely, it almost looked as though he had a limp. He had such an unusual gait.
This is the story of how DNA finally caught the killer of Lynette White.
The Lynette White case demonstrated the real importance of the new approaches we were bringing to cold case work. And the other thing it did was finally sort out once and for all who was guilty of Lynette's murder.
Town, Cardiff, 1988. Lynette White was just 20 years old when she was found stabbed to death in this flat above a bookmaker's. John Williams is a writer and journalist who covered the case and its consequences.
Lynette White was a sex worker from Cardiff. She's a girl who'd had a very troubled childhood. She was found in a room that belonged to a friend of hers. She'd been stabbed something like 58 times.
John Actie was 26 years old at the time and living in this part of Cardiff. He knew Lynette a little, just enough to say hello.
This is James Street. This is where the young lady was killed. The first I heard about Lynette White's death was on the Monday morning, the 15th, the day before my daughter's birth. And then I got the paper, but I went, oh my God, I know this girl from walking around the streets, you know? It's the first time I've stood out here. She was a young lady, you know, and it's just sad that she went through such a brutal murder.
In December 1988, after a 9-month investigation, the police arrested 5 men for Lynette's murder. John Actie was one of them.
The police knocked my door and asked me if I could accompany them to the police station. You've been dragged from your house, taken to a police cell, 4 days, questioning. Then he took me back to another police station and then he charged me. And I didn't come out of jail for the next 2 years. You know, they put me in jail for a crime I never committed.
All 5 men protested their innocence, and there was no forensic evidence to link them to the crime. But they would be held in custody for 2 years awaiting the trial. The prosecution case rested on witness statements that have since been discredited and a confession from one of the men which implicated all 5 of them.
The real key piece of evidence was the confession of Stephen Miller, who was Lynette White's boyfriend. Stephen Miller was a vulnerable young man. He was assessed as having, low IQ. Not only did they badger him, but they also led him on. They provided him with evidence, and after hours and hours of questioning, he had confessed to killing her.
They was feeding him a story, saying, you went in there with him, he done this, he was done that. Remember, he had 20 interviews. Oh, you know how many hours that is? That's torture.
At trial, John Actie and one other defendant were cleared by the jury, but Stephen Miller and 2 others were convicted and sentenced to life. They became known as the Cardiff Three. With public support, their families campaigned to prove their innocence. Finally, in December 1992, Miller's confession was deemed inadmissible and they were freed. But the mystery of who killed Lynette White remained unanswered, leaving the killer at large.
They walk in the streets!
Lynette's family searching for justice, and a stubborn shadow over the innocence of all the men involved.
I was living under a shadow of suspicion. Yeah, I've been called the murderer a few times. Being accused of killing a young girl, stabbing her 50 to 70 times. How could you live with yourself to think about doing something like that?
In 1999, a cold case unit was set up to reinvestigate the case and find the real killer. Detectives hoped advances in forensic science could now reveal new evidence, and they turned to expert witness Angela Gallup.
One of the things we decided to do as part of our strategy was to have a look at everything that had been seized that hadn't been looked at before, however insignificant. And so we were looking at things like bits of biscuit wrappers and the cellophane that went round a cigarette packet.
The innocuous piece of cellophane revealed an intriguing item of evidence, a blood droplet formed in a very distinctive shape.
That was really important because that indicated that it had been airborne, so a tiny droplet of blood had landed on the cellophane, and that meant that it could have come from the offender.
Angela now used modern DNA analysis to begin to identify which individual this blood had come from.
It was a male profile, and that was the beginning of the unlocking of that case, and we called him Cellophane Man, because you have to refer to these things some way, and he became massive in the investigation.
Cellophane Man's blood did not match any other samples originally recovered from the crime scene in 1988, and one speck was not enough to prove he killed Lynette White. But crime scene photographs showed distinctive blood staining on one area of skirting board.
We'd noticed there was some sort of blood splashing very close to Lynette's body of the right kind of the right type to have been shed from someone who was bleeding and wielding a weapon.
Angela believed this was the killer's blood. The question was, would any still be there over 10 years later?
I visited the murder flat 3 or 4 years after the actual murder, and there was blood stains all over the walls. Someone had put one thin coat of white paint over it, but you could still see the blood stains. It was absolutely, absolutely horrifying.
It had been over a decade since Lynette White was murdered. Now, Angela hoped to find the killer's blood still at the crime scene and to use it to finally unlock the real murderer's identity.
The whole flat had been painted twice in the intervening years, and we scraped very carefully away at the relevant section of skirting board to try and reveal the blood under a low-power microscope with a scalpel. We recognised how risky this was because it would only be sort of relatively small amounts of blood, we thought, underneath the paint. And we didn't know exactly what depth it was. So we had to go really, really carefully so that we didn't go too shallow and never reveal it, and we didn't go too deep and lose it all.
This painstaking work took 2 weeks, but finally Angela's team found what they were looking for.
We were able to discover some blood under the paint, and that also turned out to be the same DNA profile as Cellophane Man. And that meant that the person it came from must have had something to do with the murder.
Analysis of the blood revealed a full DNA profile, but when it was compared to the police DNA database, they could find no match, so detectives stepped up their investigation.
The police then did a mass screening of local people. They collected samples from them and we tested them against Cellophane Man, but they didn't get anywhere with that.
It seemed the identity of Lynette's murderer was going to remain a mystery.
I think so long after the murder, people were starting to wonder whether, they would ever find the killer, or whether one would just have to accept that it was just some random guy who'd got away with it.
But Angela and her team refused to give up.
We decided not to abandon the database, but to go back and see if we could find some family member, so someone whose DNA matched quite a lot of Cellophane Man's DNA, but obviously wasn't. So we started off looking at the rarest component of Cellophane Man's profile. It occurred in about 1 in 100 of the population.
This comparison identified 70 possible matches, and further DNA analysis reduced that to just one person. But there was a problem. The DNA match was with a juvenile.
The young man in question was a toddler at the time of the murder, so he clearly wasn't the murderer. But what they realised was that they could have a look at the family of this guy.
We looked at the father. It wasn't him, he was very close though, so we felt we were completely on the right track. Then we looked at the father's brother, and it wasn't him, but he was very close. And then the police discovered that there was another brother. They got a sample from him, and we profiled that. And that turned out to be the match, and that was Jeffrey Gaffor.
Jeffrey Gaffor was now 37 and working as a security guard. In 1988, when Lynette White was murdered, he was living and working in his family shop in Cardiff.
He was the original quiet loner, and it appears to be more or less his only serious offence that anyone knows of was this murder.
The cold case team arrested Jeffrey Gaffor. When questioned, he broke down and confessed to the murder of Lynette White 15 years earlier.
By his account, he had asked her for sex, he'd gone back to the flat, and then he changed his mind, and she wouldn't give him his money back, and he lost his temper, and then he stabbed her to death.
In court, Gaffor pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life. Angela's evidence made forensic science history. It was the first time that this kind of familial DNA profiling had been successfully used in a cold case to bring a murderer to trial.
This was the first time that it was used and someone was still alive and they could be charged, and they were ultimately convicted.
The case also made history in another way. Gaffor's conviction meant the 5 men wrongfully arrested in 1988 were at last completely exonerated.
This was the first time in a miscarriage of justice case that the actual murderer had been convicted of the murder. It's only once Jeffrey Gaffor was convicted that these guys were able to, walk the streets without, a cloud of suspicion following them.
I'm definitely angry. I've always been angry since. They say, oh, don't be angry, let it go. Well, you let it go. Go and sit in the cell for 2 years, take it away from your family.
It is a case that I'm very proud of, and proud of the scientists that worked with me. It showed how powerful DNA profiling had become. But on another level, and over above all of that, it finally gave closure to Lynette's family, because they were finally looking at the person who had killed their daughter or their relative.
If you're being mugged in Lewisham, how are you on camera a stone's throw from the murder scene?
The way every person walks or runs is actually unique. In forensic gait analysis, you're trying to detect small differences in how a part of the body is moving.
January 2007, Vauxhall, London. It's a Saturday. New Zealander Kathy Marlo has gone to her office to catch up on some work. She then plans to meet friends for lunch, but never turned up. Later that day, her body was discovered at her office. She'd been strangled. Detective Damien Allen was put in charge of the investigation.
We had marks that led from the attack site to a communal shower room, and Kathy's body was found in the shower cubicle.
Kathy's hometown was Hawke's Bay in New Zealand, where her sister Debbie was about to receive the terrible news.
2:28 a.m. and our doorbell rang, and the police don't call at that time for nothing. So, yeah, they asked me to get up and come down into the lounge, and they just said that there'd been an incident at Catherine's workplace, and I think it took them a while actually to tell us that she'd passed.
Kathy Marlo was just 28 years old when she was killed. She had been away from home for 3 years.
She was vivacious, a much loved sibling and daughter. There's only so much you can do in small town New Zealand, so she was quite keen to get out there and experience the world, really. And you expect them to come back in one piece, and my brother and I did it, and so why shouldn't she?
Kathy's colleagues have paid tribute to her, describing her as a bright, much-loved and highly regarded young woman.
Senior investigating officer Damien and his team began with a fingertip forensic search of the offices and surrounding area. The circumstances of the attack remained a mystery.
It may be a colleague, it may be a stranger, we don't know. So I remain open-minded, hence the importance of the forensic work we're doing. There were no witnesses. We had a complicated forensic scene. There was no CCTV inside the venue, but there were cameras dotted about, in the locality.
Police had hundreds of hours of CCTV to scroll through, but after weeks of false leads, they had still not identified any firm suspects.
It's a popular misconception by the public that CCTV is the panacea when it comes to investigations, but the reality is somewhat different. It's a busy urban area. You've got lots of cameras, varying quality. Does it depict to a good enough standard the facial imagery? And the answer to that question is quite often no.
Weeks went by, and with increasing media scrutiny, the pressure was on Damien's investigation. After 4 weeks, he and the team had made slow progress, and then a big leap forward.
I had a call from the Forensic Science Laboratory to say, we've identified one male DNA profile from 2 separate fingernails, which was, a real breakthrough for us.
The profile matched 31-year-old Matthew Fagan, a web production manager who had moved to the UK from America in 2001. He was on the police database because of a minor offence for drunkenness. He also had a connection to where Kathy worked.
So we had a hit, and we now had a potential suspect. And what we established was that Fagan had worked for that company, the same company Kathy had worked for, and really he was an underperforming employee that ultimately resulted in him being sacked 6 months previously.
Fagan's DNA was found on Kathy's fingernails, but because they had shared an office, it wasn't conclusive proof he had attacked her. But Damien did now have his first possible suspect. And when detectives returned to the CCTV, they found another crucial clue.
So here's the CCTV camera that picks up Fagan heading towards the scene. But that was a shot through this iron gate. So we've got Fagan at about 13:02, 13:03, moving towards the the office block where Cathy worked, so this is in advance of the murder.
2 hours later, Fagan can be seen again.
This street was quite important because this is where Fagan was captured twice on CCTV, just after 3 o'clock, walking away from 66 South Lambeth Road. This is at 15:03, and this is after the murder's taken place. And it looks as though he's carrying something at this point.
Fagan was brought in for questioning, but insisted the person seen on camera was not him. He even gave an alibi. Fagan claimed he was 5 miles away in Lewisham, that he had been mugged, injured his head, and had then gone to hospital to have his injuries looked at. Damien wasn't convinced.
We found no evidence that he had been in Lewisham at that time, and no evidence of any journey there, whether by walking, public transport or vehicle.
The hospital confirmed Fagan did have a head injury, and he could be seen on their CCTV checking in at reception. But Damien believed he was injured not in Lewisham, but 5 miles away in Vauxhall around the time Cathy was attacked. Now, he needed to prove it. The problem was the CCTV footage was nowhere near clear enough to do that in a court of law. But Damien had another idea.
And part of the role of being a senior investigating officer is understanding what is available out there in terms of forensic experts. You know, what tools in the box could you employ to help you improve the case that you put before the jury? And when you looked closely at how Fagan walked, it almost looked as though he had a limp. He had such an unusual gait.
Damien turned to an area of forensic science known as gait analysis.
So this is the setup from our gait laboratory.
Dr. Julie Stebbins of Oxford University is an expert in the field and runs a laboratory that analyses how people walk.
Most people fall within a fairly narrow band of how you walk. So the way we analyse people is to compare their walking patterns to a reference band. So we're looking for where they fall outside of that band.
Gait analysis allowed a comparison between footage Fagan agreed was him at hospital and the footage Damien believed was him near the crime scene.
So I would first of all look at overall how the person's moving, if there's anything about the smoothness of their walk, the symmetry of their limbs. So if you're looking at the knee from the side, I would expect the knee to be fully extended when the foot first hits the ground, then to be a slight degree of flexion, then back to fully extended as the body comes over the leg, and then the knee flexes in order to be able to swing the leg through.
Fagan's gait in this footage was then compared to the man seen in the CCTV from near the crime scene.
So if I'm trying to determine the angle at the knee, I need to be able to see the line of the upper leg and the line of the lower leg. So it would take quite a long time to examine this footage, to go through it in the amount of detail that you need to be able to identify each feature. So you would look at this over and over and over again. Forensic gait analysis, it's not that you're directed towards one feature. You have the whole person and you're trying to say, is there something about how this whole person walks that's identifiable in 2 pieces of footage? It looks like he has a bit of trunk sway to the left and possibly one of his feet pointing more than the other.
The analysis confirmed in Matthew Fagan's gait, as seen in the hospital footage, was the same as the man seen walking near the crime scene, and that this gait was distinctive enough to prove it was the same man.
It went to the heart of what Fagan was suggesting, that he was being mugged in Lewisham. Well, if you're being mugged in Lewisham, how are you on camera a stone's throw from the murder scene?
Damien confronted Fagan with the new evidence. He immediately changed his story. Fagan now claimed he was part of a gang who went to burgle the offices but fled when Kathy recognised him.
He said, I went there with others. Kathy disturbed us. They began to tie her up, and at that point, I decided to leave. So in other words, I had no involvement in this at all.
For the first time, Damien had proof Fagan was at the scene of Kathy's murder, and forensic analysis now revealed further evidence of Fagan's involvement.
So we found a hair on a fleck of flesh on the wall where the attack had taken place. We found his blood, DNA and blood underneath the desks where he'd gone to steal the laptops. So there was physical evidence of his involvement at the scene.
Blood and DNA proved Fagan was at the scene. Gait analysis proved he had tried to cover his tracks with a complicated alibi. Police believed it was a robbery that went horribly wrong, and they now had enough evidence to bring a prosecution. In September 2008, Fagan stood trial at the Old Bailey. He pleaded not guilty to murder. Kathy's sister, brother and father were also there.
I think the hardest thing was watching Fagan lying, but you just hope that Damien and his team have got it right.
They had. Fagan was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life. Damien stood with Kathy's family as they heard the verdict.
You build a relationship with the family, especially in a case like this, where you had contact with them over a long period, and you do become very close to the victims' families.
You form a real bond. He was our only link to Kath to get the right result for us as well, and make sure that the right person was brought to the courts.
Today's verdict will bring some closure in seeing that justice has been served. However, it won't bring our Catherine back. She lives in our hearts.
We got, I won't say justice, but we got the sentence that will give us the time to heal.